Welcome to all of you to our 2020 annual meeting's Governor Talks. I'm delighted that Christine Lagarde, the President of the European Central Bank, is joining us to discuss the structural transformation of the economy that we are likely to witness over the next few years. Before her appointment to the ECB, Christine Lagarde was the Managing Director of the IMF during the global financial crisis. I had the great privilege to serve as her Chief of Staff. Christine Lagarde also served in France in several ministerial posts, including as Minister of Finance. She was the first woman Minister of Finance of a G7 country. And before she joined government, she served as the chair of a major international law firm, Baker & McKenzie. Throughout her career, Christine Lagarde has tirelessly driven a policy agenda of ensuring equal opportunity for all, closing the gender gap in employment, combating inequality, and fighting climate change. Her intellectual leadership and significant contributions to the international policy agenda have been widely recognized, and she is a role model for everyone who seeks to effect change. Christine Lagarde has been a trailblazer throughout her distinguished career, with many firsts. And she certainly is the only central bank governor ever who has been featured in The Economist, Time magazine, Vanity Fair, Vogue magazine, as well as on The Daily Show. Without further ado, I now give the floor to President Lagarde.
Thank you so much, Alfred. And it gives me a great pleasure and some emotion, actually, to be on your show, which I know you are pioneering in this annual meeting of the IMF in virtual fashion, given the circumstances. So thank you for having me on your show. I thought I would use the few minutes I have to describe for colleagues, friends, and the audience that you have what kind of structural changes we believe will result from the pandemic and what kind of policies we can try to engineer in order to respond to those changes. So let me try to focus on those structural changes. And clearly, we see two categories of structural changes, the good ones and the bad ones. And as you know me, I'm a positive person, so I'm going to focus on the good ones. And the good ones are going to result from significant changes that are taking place as a result of the pandemic. If you look at, for instance, how the pandemic has changed the nature of domestic activity, it's quite amazing. You are working remotely, I am working remotely, and yet we are communicating and we are achieving something, or trying to. In Europe, 50% of employees during the lockdown period worked remotely. And of those 50%, only 10% have the urge to go back to office work as it was. So we can be pretty certain that work as it was is going to be different as it will. Second way in which domestic life has changed is the way we shop, the way we buy, the way we pay. So if you look at retail shopping, as we used to know it for most of us, it has been significantly replaced by e-commerce. And I just want to make sure that I'm giving you the right number, which I have here. In Europe, e-commerce has increased by almost a fifth in terms of volume of sales just between February and June 2020. That is also likely to stay with us. And I was saying the way we work, the way we buy and trade, but also the way we pay. Digital payments has really increased significantly. And in those countries of Europe, one that you know well, Germany, for instance, or Italy, where cash was king and people walked around with banknotes, there is a significant change underway with much more confidence in digital payment. And as you know, the ECB is very seriously looking at a digital euro. So those are the domestic changes that we see that will entail structural changes in the way consumers behave, in the way they work, in the way they pay, in the way they shop. Let's now look at how what has been a trend in our economies for the last 30 years or so, globalization, is also impacted and will entail structural changes. We believe that we will see a new wave of service-driven globalization. Let me just give you an example, very much close to home. One of my sister-in-law is an oncologist. She used to see her patients at the hospital for their regular checkups and for weekly, monthly, biannual visits. During the 2.5 months of lockdown period, she had all those visits remotely, using any of those devices that we are now using to see each other and to talk to each other. Well, guess what? Both patients and doctors are finding that those sort of remote diagnosis and capacity to see each other, talk to each other without the inconvenience and the fatigue of traveling to hospital is actually working well. Not as a complete substitute, just like digital euro will never be a substitute for cash, but as a very good supplement and a very good partial substitute to what was being done physically. And that will have an impact on the volume of services that are tradable and on the access that people will have to those services. And that was only just a minor example. There will be plenty of other categories of services that will be impacted by a combination of this facilitated access and probably accelerated use of devices like artificial intelligence. Second thing, supply chains. That's an interesting phenomenon because there was great assumption that supply chains would all be shortened, that we would see a lot of reshoring or onshoring as opposed to offshoring. Well, based on studies and surveys that have been conducted recently, the results are the following. 60% of multinational companies say that they have responded to COVID by adopting more digital technologies. So the rise of the robots that predated COVID is likely to be accelerated as a result. And almost 40% of those companies surveyed have said that they have diversified suppliers and sourcing countries, but only 15% have indicated that they have reshored or nearshored and therefore completely disrupted their supply chains. Interesting too. Now, all of that is probably right as long as protectionism does not rise more than it has already up until now. Second category of structural changes that we are anticipating will have to do with what, as you know, is dear to my heart, a greener economy. COVID has intersected with and reinforced the green agenda. And various studies have found, for instance, that areas with higher air pollution have greater caseloads and hospitalizations of people from COVID. Second, people who are most concerned about COVID-19 are most concerned about violation of environmental and food safety and regulations, notably in the United States. So you can see that there is a close connection between climate change situation, the air pollution, the concern that people have about the environment, and COVID-19. Again, this has operated as an accelerator and sometimes as a triggering factor. And in that particular context, citizens are going to drive the change. In 16 countries in the euro area, we have found out through surveys and studies that 75% of the population actually expects their government to put environmental protection and climate change at the top of their priorities. And spending priorities have actually shifted as well. More than 20% of COVID-related stimulus spending has been allocated to green projects in the European Union, compared with only 1% in the US and 2% in China. So clearly in this part of the world, in the European Union, those green priorities are taking roots in the form of actual investment. Now, those were I would say, the good structural changes that are happening with transformational impact, and I'll come back to it when I talk about policies. But there are structural changes that can also happen for the wrong reasons. That is, for instance, if viable firms actually go out of business permanently because of the COVID-19 restrictions or because they have not had access to liquidity. Pandemic weighs on economic potential. There is clear research and results from a study of all the pandemics that have taken place in the world ever since 2002 with SARS that indicates that post-pandemic periods are associated with a decline of productivity, 6% in the main, and 11% lower investment, not in a couple of years after the pandemic has been defeated, but 5 years after the pandemic has been defeated. And it is also a case that healthy firms suffer from recurring restrictions. If you keep firms, without contact, without liquidity, without easy access to their suppliers for more than 2 months, they begin seeing clearly significant impairment of their capacity. Now, all this can lead to what is very well known by economists as hysteresis in the labor market and higher inequality. Hysteresis in the labor market is that people who have not been at work suddenly and gradually, or gradually more than suddenly actually, begin losing their skills and eventually feel ill-suited for the employment market when it resumes. Now, sectors hardest hit by restrictions are also those sectors that are job-rich. You talk about the wholesale and the retail trade, you talk about accommodation and food, you talk about transportation. All of that has contributed to a quarter of euro area job growth after 2013, and those are the sectors that are badly hit by the pandemic. And the lowest income people are generally also those that are going to be mostly threatened, because if you add 2 months of lockdown plus a few months at 80% capacity, it's estimated to increase the Gini coefficient in Europe by almost 14%. So in response to those structural changes that you want, the good ones that you want to encourage, and the structural threat that you want to guard against or fight against, clearly policies can have an impact. And they have to be forward-looking. They have to be anchored into the medium term. My first concern at this point in time is that policies are tailored in such a way that we can avoid the cliff effect. In other words, the fact that some of the policies that were put in place during the pandemic, be it in the form of moratorium, in the form of guarantees, in the form of furlough or Kurzarbeit schemes, that they be stopped suddenly. So clearly what we hope policymakers will understand and will determine is that those supports have to be continued for a period of time, even as the recovery takes hold and even as the pandemic gradually phases out, so that there is a smooth transition into a full-fledged recovery. And not only a full transition into a full-fledged recovery, but a full transition into the other policies that will be put in place in order to support new activities. Because it will also be the case that new companies are set up, that new jobs will arise. And those policies have to be launched in parallel with the phasing out support that is badly needed. So what policies do I have in mind for that? They are of three categories, essentially. And I'll give you the example of new activities, startups that account for a lot of the job creations. And it's a combination of three sets of policies which I believe are necessary. Number one, in the regulatory environment. Number two, in the investment. And number three, in education and training. In the regulatory environment, we now have studies that really identify smart regulation and efficient regulation as likely to support startups more so than they would support the incumbent. A contrario, poor regulations, slow-moving bankruptcy procedures, for instance, poorly enforced rule of law, failure to properly enforce a contract, that is going to prejudice startups more so than incumbents. So a good regulatory framework that actually supports the ecosystem in which startups can actually start and thrive is critically important. It interlocks with the second category, which is investment. And here we are particularly lucky in Europe that policymakers have decided to invest massively into the future through what is called the New Generation EU, which is endowed with 750 billion euros, some of which will be actually attributed by way of grants, some of which lent to those countries that need it. And those investments, clearly public money, will be invested in those sectors that will actually structure for the better our economies, into green and into digital. Those are the two key areas that have been identified in order to stir the recovery going forward. It's necessary because Europe has been lagging behind. When you look at the digital investment in particular, or the knowledge economy, there is quite a bit of ground to cover if Europe wants to be at least on a par with the United States, for instance. So, sound, good, solid, efficient regulatory environment, well-targeted, focused public investment that will trigger private investment in turn. And the third one is education and training. Because unlike in previous recessions, we have a pretty good understanding of what kind of skill sets will be needed. Digital, the ability to serve the green industries, those are the two areas where clearly more training, more skills will be needed. And this movement that I was referring to of phasing out gradually the supports that was in place, thanks to good policies that were promptly associating the monetary policy and the fiscal policy, and the ramping of these three interlocking education, investment, and regulatory environment will be absolutely necessary going forward in order to leverage the post-pandemic, which I hope will be coming soon. That's what I wanted to give you in a nutshell, Alfred, to begin our discussion.
So you are a firm believer that if a vaccine comes quickly, we are not resorting back to the world we were in. You see this is a disruption which is has changed the behavior of people. This has changed, you said, e-commerce, that is changing payments, that is changing how corporations are working. And you see it as an opportunity to guide that change forward, to push on some of the longer-term reforms, which we have been looking at before as part of the globalization, arriving of AI, but also in terms of that we need to tackle climate change. So you're an optimist that this is actually an opportunity which we can take. And it's not going to be an opportunity, at least in Europe, which we are going to miss out on.
That is absolutely correct, yes. Well, you know me, I'm an optimist by character. And you know, it's a fact that we cannot let a bad crisis go to waste, and that we have to take every opportunity to transform our society in order to tackle some of the issues that had been around, because pandemic is operating as an accelerator of many phenomena that we had.
Are you concerned about the rise in inequality? Because we see a digital divide, rural via urban. You said the European Union is interested in further digitalization, but is way behind. Will we take care of the inequality which we saw already rising before the pandemic, and which will likely be much more pronounced coming out of the pandemic?
Yes, this is an imperative. If we look at where the pandemic has hurt most in terms of jobs, for instance, you see very clearly that, for instance, women are more affected than men in general. You see that in the service industry, those at the lower end of the wage scale are more affected than those at the higher end of the wage scale. You see that those who can telework are those at the higher end of the wage scale, as opposed to those at the lower end of the wage scale. And they have often been referred to as the heroes or the hidden heroes. And yet there is still a great degree of inequality which has not yet been addressed. The third, of my three policy recommendations, the one that deals with education and training, clearly has to tackle those that are least equipped to deal with the transformation of our societies. And the digital skills that need to be acquired is precisely the one that will help them transition and adapt to this new society. I think the same is also true with children in less privileged sections and areas of our societies, because they are the ones, for instance, whom throughout the lockdown period could not be helped by their parents, or who did not have the comfort, the space, and the broadband to operate remotely as other children could. So I think that the real focus has to be on those that have been most affected by COVID-19, because it acted as a revelator of some of the inequalities that we had before pandemic, and that sometimes we were a little bit too oblivious to.
You also mentioned the changes in e-commerce, in the payment system, and you had a recent speech on a digital euro. And I think this is also a subject which was dear to your heart early on, because you saw the opportunities there. What do you think the role of a digital euro would play in this transition?
You know, you're right, Alfred, that I saw the writings on the walls pretty early on. And in the position where I am today, it's even clearer that payments and that the media of the currency will change, both. And it's not a fancy, it's not a tantrum. It is really something that is guided by consumers' preference. It is guided by Europeans' desire to actually not use as many coins and banknotes as they used in the past, based on their determination to effect payments in a digital way, in a cheaper way, in a faster way, in a more secure way. And I think that on all these accounts, a digital currency that falls under the ambit of a central bank is actually addressing all three issues that are on consumers' mind and on European minds. It's not a 100% rosy story, because it clearly, number one, it's difficult and it's a time-consuming project. It's not going to happen overnight, if and when it is decided. Number two, if it has great benefits of being cheaper, faster, more secure, and responding to consumers' preferences, it also has its downside. And clearly, we need to consider all the consequences that it would have, depending on the way it is tailored, depending on the way it associates our current, usual intermediaries, so that we don't disrupt the system. But I think that it is here to to stay with us. It's not implemented yet. Decision has not been made yet. We are still in the review and consideration stage, but we've just launched a public consultation so that consumers and Europeans can actually express their preference and tell us whether they would be happy to use a digital euro just in the way they use a euro coin or a euro banknote, knowing that it is central bank money that is available and that they can rely upon.
You mentioned a consultation with the general public, and you always have been a great believer in communication, including with the general public. And you recently mentioned that with regard to the independence of the central bank, there is still accountability, and there is a need to explain to the public what the central bank is doing. That's an important part in order to maintain the credibility of the population and the backing of the population, including for the independence, which in a number of countries right now for central bank independence is under threat. What are your plans in terms of communication?
Well, first of all, well, two things. One is you don't communicate in a vacuum. So a central bank often has very important messages to communicate to a range of different audiences. And in that respect, we are currently conducting a strategy review in order to make sure that our monetary policy is fit for purpose. And we will be communicating on that front as we are communicating on a regular basis when we review our monetary policy. And that is the sort of traditional communication, which is the subject of many studies and review, because the communication of a central bank in and of itself is monetary policy. And the use of one word or the other, of one intonation, one inflection or the other, is going to have ramification as perceived by a particular category of audience. But second point, I also think that if a central bank is using, for instance, inflation expectations as one of its indicators, and if it is using consumers' perception of its own action as one of its compasses, then it has to clarify for consumers, for those who are sending us back their views of the economy, we have to send to them the proper mirror and the proper image of what we do for them, of how we maintain, provide, organize, care for price stability, of why we determine that a particular level of inflation or a particular range or a particular mechanism are the right way for us to guarantee that price stability. We need to explain that, and we need to explain it in normal words, not in highly sophisticated economists only understood language and words. And you know exactly what I'm talking about.
Absolutely.
So while we have to communicate with the category of audience that is completely attentive to each of those very, very specific and sophisticated words, we also need to communicate to the general public what we do, why we do it, why their view matters, and how their views can be informed, because their views matter enormously to the central bank as well. And it's a way to be, number one, transparent, to receive their information as much as they receive ours, and also to be accountable for what we do, because as you rightly pointed out, we can only be independent, which is clearly important, if we are accountable. It's part of the same story.
You mentioned a strategic review. All of these massive structural changes which are going to take place will have implications for the ECB as well. What are you focusing on in the strategic review, strategy review?
Oh, we are looking. It's a very broad exercise which encompasses in-depth review and analysis into multiple topics. It ranges from measurement of inflation and trends to price stability, including impact of climate change, including financial stability, including communication. I mean, there's a whole range of topics that all sort of are relevant to the proper delivery on our mandate, which is price stability. And we want to deep dive into all these topics just to make sure that we have explored every angle, every area that actually matter for price stability, how we define it, how we aim at it, and how we try to deliver upon it. Some people have asked me, why would you take climate change? Why is that relevant? Well, if we assume that, and I think it won't be debated, that the natural interest rate is relevant for us, then we have to appreciate why people save or invest, because it is going to have an impact on where the natural interest rate is located, which will itself have an impact on, where inflation is and what policy we should determine. Well, climate change, as has now been determined, is a major concern for people, and it's an uncertainty for many of them. If that leads them to save more, well, then clearly it has an impact on what we do. So I think the connection between all these topics, from climate change to communication to measurement of inflations, all of that is very closely interconnected and brings us to hopefully better understand what we need to do in order to serve the people of Europe with a stabilized economy.
Thank you very much. I think you made a very convincing case that while we are right now focusing on the pandemic and trying to preserve life and livelihoods, we need to focus also on these transformative policies, because we are setting the path now for hopefully a smarter, greener, and more equitable future. And we don't want to go back to low growth, low productivity, inequality, and just staring into the face of increasing climate change risks. Thank you very much for this very interesting and insightful discussions. And I would also like to thank all of you for joining us today for the 2020 annual Governor Talks. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alfred.